Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 2 Perspectives on Conflict. In this chapter, we'll be looking at different ways that we study or understand conflict, both from our past experiences, what we've learned in present, as well as how we look into the future, our worldview and our perspective into worldview. So let's dive right into the chapter. Some of the ways that shape the way we see conflict is the experiences that we had either from, or rather from growing up, or experience at home, with our families, with our friends, with school, relatives, neighbors, the communities that we are part of. All of those various experiences, interactions that we have had in the past inform the way that we look at conflict and how we understand conflict. So all of those are important, and in today's lecture we'll be looking at some of those aspects that inform the way we see conflict, and maybe having that opportunity for ourselves to think back, how do we use those experiences to look at conflict and to understand how conflict is or what it means. And some of the things that we'll be touching on today as well is, how do we think about conflict? Do we see it necessarily as something that is bad or negative? Or is it potentially something that can turn out to be good or positive? And the way that we think about conflict, whether it's more negative or as something that's more positive, also comes back to how we were raised, the experiences that we had, what we expect, or rather what we observed in our families and our communities. Another key area for us to consider today is metaphors. So we'll be looking at a few metaphors in today's lecture, but definitely you will read a lot more on different forms of metaphors that people have used to frame to understand conflict. So we'll be looking at some of that, and as well as some cultural perspectives, whether it's both from a individualistic or collectivistic perspective, as well as other traditions that inform us, that look at things differently or similarly than with others. So first up is our personal history, the way that we've been taught. Perhaps in our families, we might have noticed parents do not disagree with each other in front of the children, for instance. When that happens, the children grow up seeing that the parents do not engage in conflict. But when the children become adults themselves, when they are in relationships, whether it's a romantic or professional relationship at work, they realize that people do come together and have conflict. They may have disagreements, they might view things differently. So that may hinder or provide a different dynamic for those individuals who did not get to see that at home. On the flip side, when children grow up at home seeing that parents are always fighting, well, perhaps they might learn how to argue or how to present the different perspectives and views that each parent has or has had, but it may also make them feel like that is the only way that they should approach or think about conflict. So either scenarios where you have a child raised in families that do not experience or hear a lot of conflict or any kind of disagreement between the adults or elders at home, versus the child that grew up in a family that witnesses a lot of such disagreements, they do shape and inform the way these individuals see conflict when they become teenagers or as an adult in their work lives and as well as their homes. And all of that to say that it does make us feel either more comfortable or less comfortable about conflict, depending just by witnessing or seeing what happens at home when we were raised. So if you like, you can take a few moments right now to pause and think about what you saw at home, whether it is between your parents or maybe between your relatives, or maybe perhaps you come from a bigger family between maybe your older siblings or maybe your younger siblings. How do they interact when there is some disagreement or things that they would do not share the same perspective? So here's a good time to take a few moments if you need that. you can pause and then you can always come back to the rest of the chapter. So this early history that we have, that we experience at home or at school, there's a theory that informs this perspective, which is called the attachment styles. And we learned that, as the slides tell us, that people who grew up with those secure attachments or insecure attachments do have implications on how they are like 20 years down the road. So individuals who are securely attached when they were kids, when they are growing up, from their caregivers, they sense a source of comfort during those stressful moments. But insecurely attached infants, meaning to say, if they don't feel like the strong attachment with the adults or the caregivers at home, they don't use and cannot rely on their caregivers to provide that comfort, and they might have to go to other sources, and those can be can just make things a little bit more complicated because they don't have that ready access to comfort to make them feel that the how do you say, the conflict is not as uncomfortable. So these have implications when we think about how the child was raised, connecting with the previous slide that we looked at. And again, so extending from where we were as children, as teenagers, as we grow up, those experiences accumulate with the other experiences that we may have at school, and eventually as we grow up, we start to have part-time, full-time work experiences, whether it's at one organization or multiple organizations that we started to work at. All of those history that we accumulate, those experiences, inform the way that we either attempt to be proactive or reactive when we look at conflict, and whether how we think about we can reduce or avoid them. All of this connects with emotions. All of this connects to the emotions that we may feel about conflict, how comfortable we feel about it. Do we feel like it's something that we have to step away because it's very uncomfortable, or perhaps we might want to step away because we are frightened by it. On the other hand, some people may view conflict as an opportunity to really get to hear what the other person has to say, or a different perspective. So for them, they may have a different perspective, which is more of a maybe open mind way of thinking, that perhaps there's something to learn, perhaps there's something to gain just by hearing how someone sees things differently. And from that, there is this potential where if we can understand where the other person is coming from, then we expand the possibilities of finding a common ground or finding a way forward, even if it means that the two parties cannot reconcile. There is still a way forward. So there is something optimistic about conflict management when we are open about hearing what the other party has to say, and then thinking about how that may benefit both of them, either to come together to reach a common mutually beneficial outcome that both parties will feel happy about, or it may allow them to advance in their own directions, knowing that perhaps a resolution or a common ground is not possible, but it makes sense that they move in different directions going forward. So with that perspective, I think conflict can be something be seen more positively, and something very interesting to keep us engaged in improving the relationships we see in our lives. So we have looked at different perspectives of how we may look at conflict. We looked at history, how the experiences that we have had. And so here we talk about three different kinds of background systems. So the first one is avoidant, meaning to say people who are in conflict, they will always try to avoid the conflict. They don't want to talk about it. They try to move away from the conflict so as to not have this perhaps uncomfortable or awkward interaction, or interaction with the person that they feel like they're in conflict with. The second type is the collaborative approach or the collaborative background system, where the individuals who are in conflict, they seek to cooperate and to find a way forward that they can collectively get to the same or the shared outcomes that they desire. So this requires a lot more of effort, time, and energy, because it assumes that the parties want to be on the same page. They want to advance together towards something, towards a certain goal that they both want. And that is usually a little bit more challenging. As I've mentioned, there are a lot more time involved, energy involved, and not every type of conflict would avail this possibility, either because people just don't want to invest that time and energy, or perhaps they just do not think it is possible. And then the third type will be the aggressive or coercive system, where people try to maneuver perhaps in ways that are manipulative to make the other person feel smaller or less important. And these can be seen as these are more of the aggressive approaches that people who are seeking a win-lose outcome would more likely to apply. So having looked at the three main types of systems, we understand that conflict can be difficult to resolve or hard to move forward for the parties to understand one another. If one of them is more conflict avoidant, which means to say if the one party is less willing to share what he or she thinks or what he or she believes or anticipates to be the good outcome for both parties, then it's very hard for the other party that is more collaborative in wanting to hear or wanting to explore and learn what that first party has to share. And all of these comes again back to how our family origins, how we were raised, what we were taught as children, and what we observe when we look around in our families. And if we grew up in a family where we experience or overhear a lot of verbal or physical abuse, whether we're seeing it directly or indirectly, that can create a lot of discomfort, and that kind of violent homes, that kind of violent environment do make us worry or make us feel that conflict would necessarily evolve to become like that, and that does shape the way we think about how we approach conflict. And so counseling may help as now as either teenagers or adults or older adults, as we reflect on those histories that inform the way we think about conflict. If those experiences are now becoming more traumatic, that make us think that there is a negativity attached to conflict that is necessarily something that's bad, necessarily something that we should avoid, then counseling may be an approach to help us to process those experiences, whether it's the ones that we hear and or see or hopefully not experience firsthand. So that can be a way for us to move forward, to start to think about conflict in a less negative perspective or a less negative connotation to it, so that it helps us in our own conflicts, our lives now moving forward. And that will help us thinking about how we can be active contributors or active actors, to help to make our lives more successful and to live lives that are more safe and supportive to not just for ourselves, but as well as for others in our families, our workplace, in our communities. Here we have a definition of worldview, which is the cognitive, ethical, and perceptual frames of an individual, and these This worldview, however, is shaped what that informed the way that we think about conflict management and conflict resolution. And we can understand how someone views the world by how he or she tells the conflict or describes the conflict, either way as a way of a narrative, meaning to say like a story they can describe with different actors or individuals, how they interact and how they may come together or separate because of those instances of conflict. And another way that we can help, or rather another way that we can understand how people think about conflict from their worldview, is the types of metaphors that they use to describe the conflict, to help them process, to help them to make sense of the conflict, both in their own minds intrapersonally as well as how they describe it to other people. So through narratives as well as metaphors, it gives us insight. They give us insight into how individuals look at conflict from their worldview and how that may or may not inform their negative or positive views of conflict. So we'll be looking next at a negative views of conflict. So people who look at conflict with a negative lens or think that it's negative, they tend to do that because they think that conflict is destructive, that the outcome will always be maybe painful, hurtful, something that will make us unhappy and things like that. And so for them, that they try to avoid conflict then because they know it will lead to those unhappiness, those painful experiences or outcomes. It may have some of the cultural implications on it as well, especially depending on how we were raised. Some cultures may view conflict as necessarily or more likely to be negative, and so that will also shape the way a person may think about conflict just by thinking about it and not even approaching it just yet. So a few ways that why some people may think that conflict is negative is that they may think that harmony is normal and conflict is abnormal. They may think that when people are happy together, there is or a lot of agreement, that is necessarily normal. So when there is a disagreement, they feel like that conflict has to be negative. Another way people may think about conflict from a negative perspective is that they think that conflict happens because there is a communication breakdown. Now, that may or may not necessarily be true, but in some situations, over communication can also lead to conflict where there's so much information people just naturally disagree. And so there are other ways that people may think about conflict from a negative perspective. So other areas could be conflict happens because people's personalities disagree or because there's just something wrong about that other person that creates those different views. So that can also be another way of thinking about negative conflict in a negative way. The point that conflict should never be escalated is also a common way of thinking of conflict. However, some scholars would argue that sometimes in order for conflict to be managed or for a solution to be possible, sometimes the conflict must be escalated so that it can de-escalate. And sometimes we may think that conflict interactions must necessarily be polite or orderly, and so if it is not if it's not interacted in a polite or orderly way, we then also start to think that the conflict is negative. We may also think that anger is the only emotion that we can experience or should experience in a conflict, but I think conflict can also evoke a whole range of different emotions, including perhaps regret. That might be also a possible outcome, sadness. So it may not necessarily be anger, because anger is one that is triggered when we feel like we have to act in a certain way so as to respond to the pain that we receive or the pain that we experience through that conflict. So now that we have looked at a number of ways that why conflict or how conflict is viewed negatively, we will next proceed to look at how conflict can be viewed from a positive light. So conflict can also be viewed from a positive light, especially if we think that the relationship between the individuals are important. It's important that the individuals collaborate or work together, perhaps for something, a bigger reason, for a better good. So we'll now look at some of the advantages when we look at conflict from a positive perspective. When we think about conflict from a positive view, we are more willing to think that the relationship is worth saving, and then we should spend time, invest time for the people to come together to describe what they see as the challenges or the limitations to move forward. And that's a positive view towards conflict, because it means that perhaps the conflict is not necessarily, it's not a conflict, perhaps it's just a different explanation that the individuals look at things differently, but actually they are on the same page, actually they want the same thing. So by exploring what the other party wants, they are able to learn and exchange their perspectives, and perhaps that will lead to outcomes that are even better than what the individuals thought they can potentially achieve just by themselves or by themselves. So earlier we talked about worldviews and how they can be shaped or described through narratives. One other way is through metaphors, and here we look at metaphors as something that help us make sense. As I've mentioned several slides ago, how do we describe or make sense of those difficult experiences that we observe or become part of in a conflict? And how do we make sense of it? By comparing it to something else that we know, either something else that's happening in our lives currently at the moment, or perhaps something that we can relate to that we saw or experienced by individually in our past. So it's a way of metaphors, it's a way of like a shorthand, it's a simple description of how we think or the conflict is. And it's a very interesting way because it does shed light to what the person thinks are possibilities or potential options to go forward, or in some situations perhaps a stalemate or an impasse, impossible to move forward. Some ways that we think of conflict, and if it's seen as a win-lose kind of proposition, is to think that conflict is necessarily a war. When we think about war, or perhaps a chess game, one side wins and the other loses. It necessarily means that there will be a lot of losses in a game or in a war. So in that sense, if someone uses such metaphors to describe conflict, they probably look at it as a very destructive event or sequence or series of events that are in their lives, and they think that is be something that will be costly, both either for themselves and or the other parties involved. When we listen to learn those metaphors, it does really give us a lot of insight to how they think about the potential of getting out or improving the situation. So the narratives that the people talk about, that they talk about conflict, especially if they are going to share it with a counselor or maybe even just a friend, helps them with the process, the experiences, the emotions that they have, as well as to show them how possible that the conflict can be resolved, either through their own effort or through a collaborative effort with the other parties involved, or it may involve or it would entail bringing in a third party or a mediator. All forms of conflict, all the conflicts that we have talked about is informed by our experiences, our worldview that we have talked about in the last 20-25 minutes. And all of them becomes communicative behaviors that we express, because when we think about conflict, if we are thinking about reducing the conflict or finding a resolution, it necessarily requires some kind of communication, either through behavior or through verbal communication, so that what we understand or perceive the conflict to be can be conveyed to the other party, and as well for us to hear, to understand what the other party thinks about that conflict. So conflict essentially, fundamentally, is a communicative behavior, and to move forward it requires communication skills that we can learn as well as to practice to be better at. As we looked at in the previous slide, communication involves conflict involves communication, and communication helps us to express those perceptions that are maybe similar or perhaps they are different or perhaps even similar if the parties did not talk about and may not be aware of. So those communicative behaviors in them, what they say, it gives us insight into the attributes, the values that they attach to those metaphors and narratives that they share with us, or rather to share with the other parties involved in that conflict. And when we think about attributes, it's the meanings that people attached to those perceptions. It will be informed by what they experienced in the past, things they see in the present, and what they think the future will look like. And this slide really just provides a good summary of the introduction I've given us at the beginning of today's chapter. If we think about conflict as something that's described as from a narrative perspective, then it means that someone is using a lens to look from his or her own perspective. And it may also mean that if we shift the lens, if we look at it from a different lens, we can understand the conflict in a different view. So it's very helpful. It's always usually very helpful to process conflict from this perspective, that an event or sequence of events can be seen from different lenses. And by looking at it from different lenses, we can see the different sides, the reasons that inform or how the person looks at the conflict, whether it's positive or negative. It all comes down to interpretations, because someone could look at conflict the same way, or rather can look at the same conflict differently as someone else. For instance, if two individuals in the family are talking about who gets to use the family car, they may see it as a tension where it's a win-lose proposition. One person who gets the car means that the other doesn't get to use it. So that's one way to perceive it, but it may also mean that there is opportunities for collaborative outcome if the two parties can say, hey, why don't we use the family car together, but you go ahead and get what you need first, and then we go to the other place that I need to get to. So it is all dependent on the interpretation that people may have, that they assigned the attributes, the meanings to the facts, the events that they observe. One way to think about conflict is to use the attribution theory. The attribution theory tells us that when people are in conflict, they tend to think about themselves in more of a positive light and to cast the other party in a more negative light. This is natural because we tend to think more highly of ourselves and to be better than others. And that view may or may not be accurate, but the attribution theory tells us we tend to reason and make sense of conflict, that maybe the blame happens more on the other party than on ourselves. Continuing from the perspective of attribution theory, that means that we will have a biased view of ourselves and the other individuals involved in a conflict. So those assumptions can shape the way that we think about things, just because people have different views, the personalities are different, and how the lens, as we looked at earlier, the lens that they may use to attribute the meanings to what they see and what they observe. So earlier I talked about cultural perspectives as well at the beginning of today's lecture. As I have alluded at that point at the very beginning, there are individualistic cultures as well as collectivistic cultures that shape the way we think about conflict as well. In the next several slides, we'll cover these different cultural lands. The main ideas on this slide is that in collectivistic cultures, they try to prevent serious conflicts more than individualistic cultures would. The reason being that collectivistic cultures, they value the group identity, they value the the harmony that the larger group may have. So they will try as much as they can to minimize potential conflict that may occur within the group or community. So we contrast that with the individualistic cultures, where it typically happens in Western cultures, and they tend to value individual autonomy and expression of oneself's achievements over the good or the achievements of the whole community. In individualistic cultures, people tend to be more expressive about the conflict at hand. They'll try to resolve it either through using some form of power or by using their powers collaboratively to work it out, so to speak. They are more open to expressing what they think and then expressing how they think the best way forward is and what the differences may be. So there's a lot of communication that is very plain, expressive, and direct, assertive as well, in hopes that both parties will get to understand literally what each side is thinking about. Now, in contrast, collective cultures, on the other hand, they tend to be a little bit more ambiguous, as in it depends on how individuals infer meaning from what's been expressed. Sometimes they may not express as much, or they may not communicate as much or as directly as those in individualistic cultures, in a way to help each party to save face. And in order to do that, they may avoid accommodate, or as in to give in to the counterpart or the other party. To be more assertive and to be direct, to confront the other party can be seen as rude, and that is a negative turn towards conflict in those culture. They will try their best to follow what's best for the group and what they think the group would deem as acceptable behavior. We looked at previously in the last two slides about some distinctions about individualistic cultures versus collectivist cultures. Now, in a melting pot such as the United States, we see that there is a fusion of cultures between those two dominant groups. So individuals who live or grew up here in the United States might embrace various features or distinctions of the two cultures. So they may have some features that is more individualistic, and however, they might also have some preferences that resemble the culture of the collectivist culture. So that can make conflict management more challenging, as in it's harder to know which are the features that a specific individual or groups or community may embrace, which aspects of the individualistic culture and which aspects of the collectivistic culture that they may embrace. On the other hand, this unique combination or the unique the unique combination of features across the two types of cultures mean that there's also a wider possibility that individuals are able to explore potential possible positive outcomes. And so there is a negative side, as in it's harder to predict what the other counterpart may be like. But on the other hand, it also opens up possibilities that previously may not be an option when we look at people who are portraying strictly individualistic or collectivistic cultural domains or dimensions. So what does that tell us, regardless of the cultural perspectives that we may hold? What we have studied so far tells us that perhaps it's helpful to have both sides, both features that resemble individualistic cultures, as well as certain features that resemble the collectivistic culture. So here we see on this slide, there are times where it will make sense, or it actually is preferred, that the parties who are in conflict are clear, direct, and assertive. So being plain about what they think, and be clear and plain about what they perceive, their perceptions are. And there will be time where it is good to just take a step back and to listen and to think about the timing of how and what to speak. So it takes some perhaps experience to know when is the good time to be direct and when is the time to just take a step back and listen. So all of these boil down to understanding of different cultural perspectives on conflict, and having experience with different conflict resolution strategies to know what would be the best way forward that benefits both the conflict party, or rather all conflict parties that are involved. In the previous slide, I alluded to when to take a step back and listen. That reflects, or that gives us, is a segue to other cultural perspectives into areas that are non-verbal, which is meaning to say the body language of the individual. And body language is non-verbal communication is not just the non-verbal expressions that one may portray, but it also involves concepts such as time, how they perceive time, what is late, what is considered appropriate timing to give space to one another to speak, the place that they meet, where do they meet, where do they sit, who faces which directions, and the relationship that the individuals have, or the lack thereof, the identities of those individuals. All of these nonverbal aspects of the conflict participants come into play and are relevant to how the perception is being portrayed, either portrayed and as well as being perceived by the other counterpart. We see also that even here in the United States, there can be cultural differences significant enough between those in southern states versus those in the northern states. So either if there is such variation we find in this country, what more you can imagine when individuals are doing some kind of a cross-border international negotiation or conflict resolution across different regions of the world. As we come to full circle, as we come to wrap up this chapter, we see that conflict resolution, or conflict management rather, is perhaps most effective when people understand the differences between cultures, and culture is not necessarily just between individualistic and collectivistic, but as well as the regions that people are raised, their family history, their family experiences, and that sort of thing. And being fluent and be cognizant that people bring those different cultural and cultural as well as different experiences into a conflict, in how they perceive the lens that they use to perceive the conflict, and how it's portrayed to them, and whether they have a natural negative or positive outlook or lens in looking at the conflict at hand. So as we become more cognizant, become more aware of those cultural differences and perspectives, it's helpful for us to also to reflect upon ourselves. What are the assumptions that we take when we think about conflict? Is it a positive or negative thing? How can it be resolved? What are possible strategies that we are aware of? What are the pros of those strategies, and what might be potential downsides or cons of those strategies? As we become more aware of our own strategies and our own approach, it helps us to become more open-minded that there are other forms of approaches out there, and perhaps there are some benefits in adopting or using how people from other cultures may use in looking at conflict. And so that's the end of today's lecture.